Around the world today, there are 191 national legislatives, governing institutions which write and pass laws and policies. But there are two different types. 113 are unicameral, where all bills are passed by a single legislative chamber, and 79 are bicameral, with bills requiring approval by an upper and lower house. In most bicameral systems, lower houses hold a dominant position in the introduction and amendment of legislation, with upper houses limited to more of a ratification role. This separation originates from medieval England, where the segregation of the House of Commons and House of Lords began in 1341. But what were the reasons for the first split of Parliament and the events leading up to it? In early 14th century England, the monarch ruled over his realm with the help of his courtiers and other governing bodies. Parliament was summoned when the king needed money, usually to fund wars. It was made up of the appointed bishops and aristocrats and the elected knights and burgesses. The knights represented the 37 enfranchised shires of England, with each sending 2 representatives. The burgesses were bankers, merchants, and the urban elite, with 2 representatives from each enfranchised town and city of England. It's worth noting that despite the historic association of knights having military occupation since the reign of Edward I, most knights in Parliament were in fact lawyers or non-aristocratic landowners. At the time, the main bills passing through Parliament were about taxes and financial grants. The king could not tax clergymen due to their protected status. Also, to avoid alienating the people who controlled a significant proportion of England's land and armies, the king was wary of imposing taxes on the nobility, especially lords on the continent, for fear of them defecting to his rival, the King of France. Therefore, when the king's costly military campaigns led to sudden short-term increases in spending, new tax burdens would fall on the shoulders of those represented by the burgesses and knights. Late medieval economies still consisted largely of subsistence farming. However, trading and banking, the professions of the commons, were growing in significance. Since the burgesses and knights were experienced in finance and were more conscious of the economic consequences of overspending, they often united to vote against extravagant spending requests. By contrast, the church was not targeted, and nobles would be rewarded with land in the event of victory. It was in their interests for the military to be adequately financed, and they were therefore more likely to acquiesce to the king's financial demands. A key example of their distinct voting patterns was in 1297, when, after the crushing defeat at Stirling Bridge, English dominance over Scotland was under threat. Despite the high stakes involved, the burgesses and knights voted for a smaller subsidy for the king than the clergy and nobles. There were growing differences in the years that followed, and the two groups were given different duties at the start of parliamentary sessions, reflecting their different priorities and voting patterns. However, they still rarely met separately. In 1332, there is a record of knights and burgesses sitting apart from the nobles and clergy, but they didn't deliberate legislation. This separation was not maintained until the Stratford case, the milestone event that would make the division between the two groups permanent. In 1337, King Edward III began the 100 Years' War against the Kingdom of France. It didn't take long for this to drain the crown's resources, and the king began summoning Parliament annually to request taxes, grants, and subsidies. On the 23rd of July, 1340, he laid siege to the city of Tournai. After failing to take the city, he was compelled to sign the Treaty of Esplechin on the 25th of September. The treaty stipulated that he would not attack France for 5 years. With 3 years of grueling war having already passed, Edward found himself on the verge of bankruptcy, with little to show for the kingdom's sacrifices. Parliament refused to grant him any more funds to maintain his armies in times of peace. So long as he was in France, his influence over domestic affairs was constrained, so Edward was forced to return to England to demand financial support. Upon his arrival, John Darcy, his steward, and William Kilsby, keeper of the Privy Seal, manipulated the king into blaming their personal enemies for Parliament's defiance. One of these men was John Stratford, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Stratford had helped King Edward overthrow his mother, Queen Isabella, who had ruled as regent when Edward was young. Although Edward had wanted his mother overthrown, he now suspected that an archbishop that had betrayed one master would not hesitate to betray another. Edward declared Stratford to be guilty of treasonous sedition for trying to obstruct the war effort and for telling clergymen not to pay taxes. However, Stratford's position as an archbishop meant he had the right to be tried by a jury of peers, which were, in his case, bishops. Edward disregarded this ancient right, alienating much of the clergy and the nobility. The nobility also had the privilege to be tried by their peers, and they did not want an arbitrary suspension of such a right to become custom. Ignoring their protests, Edward brazenly denounced Stratford. The king also dismissed Stratford's brother Robert, the Lord High Chancellor, and the Treasurer William de Zouche, as well as a series of other high-ranking ministers. When Edward summoned him to London, Stratford refused to leave Canterbury, fearing for his life. For many weeks, Stratford insisted that, until Parliament was called, he would not appear before the king. A vitriolic argument ensued, in which the Archbishop infamously accused the king of tyranny. Stratford wrote, "You are making unseemly process against the law of the land and against the Great Charter, which you are bound to keep and maintain by oath." Edward feared widespread condemnation and was terrified of the possibility of being excommunicated by the Pope. He knew that he could not be seen dragging an archbishop from his cathedral in chains. The king relented, and on the 23rd of April, 1341, Parliament was summoned. Stratford arrived at Westminster on the 24th, but was locked out under the pretense of having to report to the Exchequer. This action was seen as spiteful on the king's part. In an era where the concepts of chivalry and honor were ingrained in the mindset of the ruling class, this move lost him even more support. When Stratford returned on the 27th, he was refused entry, but he forced himself in. The next day, the captain of the King's Guard, William Woade, ordered Stratford and other bishops to leave, but they refused to do so unless the king told them in person. Giles Beauchamp, a knight who favored the king, together with Darcy, repeated to Stratford's face the accusations of treason and sabotaging the war effort. Stratford retorted by administering an archiepiscopal curse, a sort of mega insult. This mattered back then, so Darcy and Beauchamp left the building in fury. In Parliament, on the 29th, when Stratford first tried to clear his name, he was shouted down by peers. However, the king had alienated Parliament. Edward had not only tried to violate legal clerical privileges, angering the clergy and the nobility, but he had also levied taxes twice over, infuriating the burghers and knights. Nobody wanted the king to have his way. On the 5th of May, an intimidating delegation of John Oxenford, who was the Lord Mayor of London, as well as 8 barons, 5 earls, 3 abbots, and all the bishops, appealed to the king for clemency on Stratford's behalf. A council of lords also affirmed the legal right for a bishop to be tried by his peers. In the face of this political revolt, Edward acquiesced and pardoned Stratford. Shockingly, he even agreed to the passing of a statute, the Trial of Peers Act 1341, which reaffirmed the privileges of the Magna Carta and promised that ministers would be answerable to Parliament. While Edward had the statute repealed 6 months later, the constitutional precedent had been set that the king could not indict a peer at will. In fact, since the Stratford case revolved entirely around the rights of the clergy and the nobility, the crisis, entirely by chance, precipitated a permanent physical separation between the burghers and knights on the one hand, and the lords and bishops on the other. It should be noted that other than the Lord Mayor of London, the delegation sent to the king was made up entirely of bishops and lords. So what was the reaction of the burghers and knights? On the one hand, they did not side with the lords because they didn't need to pick a fight to defend a right they never had. On the other hand, they didn't want to side with the king, as they were frustrated with his disregard towards the realm's finances. Their reaction was to simply stand aside and remove themselves from the controversy. This was the final trigger, which catalyzed the permanent separation of the two chambers, and with it, the beginning of the bicameral system. Anticlimactic though the final cause of the separation may have been, the Commons and the Lords were now inviolably separated, each with their own powers and important roles to play in the governance of the realm. In the decades that followed, the Commons would invent the process of impeachment and appoint their first Speaker of the House. In the subsequent centuries, the Commons would come to dominate both the British legislative and executive. Today, of the 79 nations which have bicameral legislatives, 33 of them are former British colonies, and more, like France, directly emulated the British system. They can all trace their origins back to the momentous events which took place in 1341. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe.